This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. Another police encounter with an African-American results in death, and regular commentator Fred Rotondaro examines the nothingness that leads to somebody dying. Author Richard Heinberg says fracking may become less of an issue because its cost to energy companies is more than the return. And Bill Press talks with Peter Kornbluh about relations with Cuba. Are you tired of Tea Party Republicans and Rush Limbaugh dominating the airwaves? Do you want the facts you won't get on Fox or even on CNN? Then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Fred Rotondaro looks at the outbreak of police-citizen violence and suggests that it's more about class than race. And we say hello to our friend Fred Rotondaro here on americasdemocrats.org. Of course, Fred, regular commentator for americasdemocrats.org and is chair of Catholics in Alliance for the Common Good. Fred Rotondaro, thanks for joining us again today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thank you, Jim. Delighted to be here as always.
Yeah, and it is always nice to talk with you. Gosh, it's just been a crazy time. What's your take on the crisis sweeping America's cities regarding police and community relations?
I think, Jim, to simplify a little bit, we are simply reaching the essence, reaching the real epitome of a crisis that's been building for so very, very long. When we look at television, we see young black men, we see cops, we see signs of brutality or violence. But it's more than just the young black guys. It's more than the cops. We've got a culture that tragically, as I say, has been building for so very, very long. We've got young black men with no jobs. We've got cops in a dangerous situation, sometimes without a lot of public support. And even the good cops, bad cops, good cops outnumber the bad ones, but these guys have got to stay together. You know, they can't be breaking ranks. So even when the bad cops do something wrong, you see these good cops psychologically saying, he's going to protect my back. He's going to keep me from getting hurt the next go-round. And what you've got, I think, is a situation in which people at the lowest level, the cops, African Americans in neighborhoods without hope, that are, in a sense, pitted against one another by a society that sadly and very, very tragically has kind of dehumanized so much of life. I look at what's going on in all of these places. And remember, one of the things that I think is kind of interesting is that in all of the cases where black men have been killed, wounded, etc., none of these guys was doing anything that amounted to very much more than a misdemeanor. One guy, the guy in New York, was peddling loose cigarettes. The man in Ferguson was walking on the street, got into an altercation with a policeman. These bits of nothingness escalate into violence with somebody dying. And I think that is symptomatic of how the country has begun to dehumanize lives. We go to wars that are not necessary. We have a gun violence that is absolutely insane. We give tax breaks to banks, millionaires, corporations, while we're taking food stamps away from kids. The great historian of slavery, Clyde Breon Davis, has written a new book, a concluding book on a cycle of American slavery. And in that book, his opening chapter talks about the attempt by slaveholders to dehumanize their slaves. If they're not really human, you can do anything you want. And I think remnants of that thinking have continued down to the present day. But I don't think it's only a question of race. I think it's also a question of class. If you don't have money, you don't have power, you're really, really not worth quite as much as the man or woman down the street who has both money and power. So it's an enormously complicated issue.
Well, and of course, you're active in the progressive Catholic movement. Could you speak to the role of the church, one of the world's wealthier institutions, in easing the pain and poverty of modern urban life?
Sure, I'd be very, very happy to. One of the reasons I got involved in the progressive Catholic movement was I was working a bunch of years ago on some social issues, and I came to realize that the church, instead of easing pain, was not doing very much to alleviate it. The church does some wonderful, absolutely wonderful charitable programs. Catholic Charities is one of the great organizations in the world. But sometimes the church has been an enabler of things that are wrong. I have pointed out in writing, interviews and such, that I think that for the last 20 or 30 years, the church, particularly in America, has effectively said to right-wing politicians, say the right things about abortion, say the right things about being opposed to gay marriage, and you can do anything you want on economic and social issues. Mm-hmm. And I think this is a tragedy. I notice that anyone notices that the decline of the American middle class began around 35, 40 years ago. Poverty has been rampant through this period of time with certain periods when it has been improved. But before that time, the church and organized labor formed a bulwark against corporate excess. Along came Roe versus Wade. The church was divorced from organized labor, and we found that corporations literally began to buy American political parties. I think American corporations own the Republican Party. I think American corporations have far too much influence in the Democratic Party. And where once there was a counterforce, the church and the unions, that no longer exists. The church has been too preoccupied with issues such as opposition to gay rights, and the unions are, as we all know, very much weaker. I think that's got to change. There's got to be more of a balance in American life. If it doesn't come, I really am very concerned. I'm very concerned about the future of our country and about, very frankly, the democratic process being destroyed.
Well, and from the Catholic standpoint, there's now a leader of the church. This pope is somebody who is clearly much more progressive than any pope we've ever seen. So
absolutely.
I would think that is reason to hold out hope.
Oh, absolutely. There's a great amount of hope. We recently, by we, I mean Catholics in Alliance and a few other organizations, organized a project that we're now calling the Pope Francis Project. And the theme of this is to bring together economic groups, faith groups, labor unions, and to try to work on behalf of the average American, to try to work on behalf of American working families, which, as you know, Jim, and I hope our listeners know this as well, the American working family has seen their income rise about 10% in the last 35 years. Not 10% a year, 10%, period, stop. Mm-hmm. That's as much as it's risen. Throw in inflation, you've got nothing. At the same time this has taken place, CEO salaries, let's just use the Fortune 500 as an example. The average CEO salary of a Fortune 500 company 35 years ago was $1 million. Today it's $14 million. Executive salaries have gone up about 300%. Stock market has gone from below 1,000 to 18,000, and yet the working family has been given absolutely nothing. And I think the church is in a position to begin to fight against that. And I think it's beginning to do that, obviously, under the leadership of Pope Francis.
Okay, we're speaking with Fred Rotondaro, chair of the Catholics in Alliance for the Common Good, also a regular commentator here on americasdemocrats.org. Fred, socialist independent Bernie Sanders is running for the Democratic nomination for president. Do you agree with him that most people would agree with the progressive agenda once we can get beyond labels?
Oh, I definitely do. Yeah, definitely, Jim, I do.
Why should the Democratic Party even entertain the candidacy of someone who won't declare himself a Democrat?
Sanders caucuses with the Democrats. He is technically a socialist, but once again, I just think that's a label that's kind of meaningless. He caucuses with the Democrats. Democrats vote for him. He's not going to get the nomination, but I am delighted that he is in the. I am delighted he's in the battle. He is giving a message we need to hear, and to me, Jim, I think the most important theme of the election in 2016 is to elect a Congress and to elect a president that will put the interest of the average American ahead of the interest of concentrated wealth. This has not happened for, I'd say, back 30, 35 years, since the beginning of the Reagan presidency. We need to do that. And Bernie Sanders is calling attention to the role of banks, the role of major businesses in this country. We've got to do that. We've got to counter that concentrated wealth. Otherwise, the America that we have grown up in is definitely going to be changed forever. And there are some people who say it's already been changed beyond redemption. I'm not one of those.
Do you see anyone else jumping into this? I mean, obviously, if Hillary Clinton's there by herself, that's not a good thing historically for either side, to just have the one candidate and all eggs in that basket. So Bernie Sanders jumps in. Do you see anybody else coming in? Do you see anybody actually being a legitimate threat to Hillary Clinton?
Legitimate threat, no, not unless Elizabeth Warren gets in. And I don't think she's going to get in unless Hillary Clinton goes so far to the right, which I don't think she's going to do. She's too smart a politician. And my friend, John Podesta, is her general chairman. He's too smart a politician. And, of course, she's got the great politician of the last 40 years by her side, her husband, Bill Clinton. So, no, I don't see her. I don't see her moving that far right. And unless that happens, I really don't see Elizabeth Warren getting in. Martin O'Malley, I think Martin O'Malley is going to run. And I think he's going to run for a variety of reasons, but I think he will run. Does he pose a threat to Hillary Clinton? No.
No, but it does give him more name recognition for the next go-around, perhaps.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And of course, there's always a possibility he could be a vice presidential running mate. Mm-hmm. But I think Hillary's pretty well got the nod. Although, if I may make one final point, there was a poll not too long ago that showed Hillary Clinton leading in New Hampshire. She got 46% of the Democratic voters polled. But when you add the totals up for Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, you had them combined getting 35%. That's 1/3 of Democratic voters saying, gee, we'd really like somebody on the far left that's going to tackle concentrated wealth.
Before we let you go, do you think Hillary Clinton's campaign has gotten off to a rocky start, given the widespread public feeling that she's not terribly honest or open?
Yeah, I do think it's gotten off to a rocky start. I think it will dramatically improve. And I noticed some polls yesterday that show that the rocky start hasn't really hurt her favorability rating. She's still in pretty solid state. Yeah, she's definitely gotten off to a bumpy start on both the issue of the emails and obviously on the money that has gone to her foundation. But I think she'll get over it. Benghazi is a fraud. There have been a number of congressional investigations. I think about 3 of them were headed by Republicans, and they all said, ain't nothing there. There's no there. Nevertheless, the far right is going to continue on that up until Election Day, but it's not going to have much traction beyond that percentage of the voters that hate Hillary Clinton and would not support her under any circumstances.
Well, this is the first of many conversations to come about this this run for the next president of the United States. And Fred, we appreciate your time with us today talking about it, and we look forward to having you back again real soon.
Thank you, Jim. I look forward to it also.
Thanks very much. Fred Rotondaro, regular commentator here for AmericasDemocrats.org, chair of Catholics in Alliance for the Common Good, joining us today on AmericasDemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for Stand Up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future and help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for Stand Up Democrats. Energy expert and author Richard Heinberg says that fracking may no longer be cost-efficient with the price of fuel declining. But, he says, we are on the verge of an ecological disaster. We'll talk to him more about that in just a moment. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
By a 1-vote margin, the U.S. Senate passed fast-track authority to expedite passage of the disastrous Trans-Pacific Partnership deal, which will export beaucoup more of our country's middle-class jobs. That's the kind of pro-corporate stupidity the Republican Congress specializes in these days. But wait, the key votes for the fast-track came from a baker's dozen of Senate Democrats. Fast-track is a railroad job to enthrone global corporate power over us. It will allow the Obama administration to send the massive 12-country trade scam to Congress for an up or down vote with little debate and no amendments allowed. Details of this thing are being negotiated in strict secrecy between top government officials and top executives of some 500 global corporations. Workers, consumers, and all the rest of us are shut out. The majority of Americans oppose this giveaway, so what's with the 13 turncoat Democrats? Not to worry, they say, trade benefits everyone. Do they think we have sucker wrappers around our heads? Americans know that these trade schemes make the super-rich richer, while the incomes of practically everyone else go south. There's still a chance to defeat the TPP because a gritty, well-organized populist coalition is rallying grassroots opposition to reject this raw deal. To join the fight, go to citizen.org/trade. This is Jim Hightower saying, and don't forget the 13 Democratic sellouts. If any one of them had stood with the people on the fast-track vote, we would have already derailed TPP. The 13 senators who said nuts to you are Michael Bennet, Maria Cantwell, Tom Carper, Chris Coons, Dianne Feinstein, Heidi Heitkamp, Tim Kaine, Claire McCaskill, Patty Murray, Bill Nelson, Jean Shaheen, Mark Warner, and Ron Wyden.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for Stand Up Democrats. Author Richard Heinberg says public acceptance of the global warming crisis is growing and that we're running out of time before an economic and ecological disaster. And we say hello to Richard Heinberg, Senior Fellow of the Post-Carbon Institute, also widely regarded as one of the world's most effective communicators of the urgent need to transition away from fossil fuels. He is the author of 11 previous books, and his latest is Afterburn, Society Beyond Fossil Fuels. Richard Heinberg, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
It's a pleasure being with you, Jim.
In your book, you sound like a Paul Revere warning the public about a rapid end of an oil-based economy. When will we run out of oil and natural gas?
Well, we'll never run out of oil or natural gas. And the reason I say that is that there will come a point when it's economically senseless to continue extracting the stuff from the ground, but there will still be lots there. Now, how can I be confident in saying that? Well, it takes energy to get energy. It takes energy to drill an oil well and to pump oil out of the ground. But we count on the fact that, the oil that we get out of the ground is going to have a lot more energy in it than we've invested in the process of producing it. And historically, that's been true. The energy return on energy invested in producing oil back in the 1930s was 50 to 1 or 100 to 1, and that's amazingly profitable energy production. Now, that energy profit ratio is falling, and it's falling fast. Currently in the U.S., the energy profit on producing oil is about 10 to 1. So we're moving down to the point where it's going to be about 1 to 1. With tar sands in Canada, by the way, it's about 5 to 1. So what happens when we get to a 1 to 1 ratio? At that point, we'll be investing as much energy in oil production as we'll get from the oil that we produce. At that point, oil may still be useful as a lubricant or a feedstock for plastics or something, but it will cease to be a fuel. And, that point will arrive fairly soon. We're talking about, years, maybe a couple of decades, certainly not centuries from now. And when it happens, there will still be a lot of oil and natural gas in the ground. So, this isn't something that energy economists have been warning the world about, but it's really, you see it in the balance sheets of the oil companies that are spending more and more money looking for oil and producing oil, and producing less and less oil with that investment.
It's interesting because whenever there's talk, especially within the media, about the prices at the pumps and up or down or whatever, it's all based on supply and demand. What
right.
You're suggesting here is something more than just supply and demand. Obviously, it's also what's it costing that energy company to produce that oil or natural gas.
Yeah, it's what it's costing them in money, but it's also what it's costing society in energy. Mm-hmm. And as the energy profit ratio of society as a whole declines, then it shows up in all different parts of the economy in sometimes surprising ways. And it just looks like it's harder and harder for the economy to grow. And isn't that what we've been seeing over the past decade? Economic growth is slowly coming to a halt. And we're blaming the financial system, we're blaming the real estate prices and all different things. But at the bottom of it all is the energy system, because without energy, nothing happens. It's the real basis, the physical basis of the economy. And as our energy return on energy invested in producing energy declines, then that makes everything harder to do.
Environmentalists like yourself have been predicting a drop-off in oil production for years, but depending on the month or year, oil production actually seems to increase. So what's going on?
Well, all the increase in the last few years has come from North America, and in North America it's all come from two sources, the tar sands in Canada and what folks in the industry call tight oil. It's produced from fracking, and most of that's come from North Dakota and South Texas. Now, why the fracking revolution? Well, it's happened because we had really high oil prices starting in the last decade. Prices had been around $10 a barrel, and they got bid up to over $100 a barrel. And with oil prices that high, it made sense for a bunch of small companies to borrow a lot of money and go drilling in some of the worst oil reservoirs left in North America, which is what we're talking about. as long as interest rates remain low so they can maintain those high levels of debt, and as long as oil prices remain high, then we can continue seeing an annual bump in world oil production. But, the last few months we've actually seen oil prices declining because the demand just isn't there for $100 a barrel oil. And as a result, drilling rigs are being idled, and I think this fracking boom probably doesn't have very long legs. We'll likely see higher prices and possibly declining production, maybe within 18 months or so.
You talk about building a sufficiency economy and a post-carbon theory of change. How would you describe that theory, and what should the economy look like without so much carbon-based energy?
Well, in the 20th century, economists say that our biggest problem, especially in the early part of the century, was lack of demand. We had overproduction of goods, and that partly resulted from cheap fossil fuels. With so much cheap energy, we could make consumer goods faster than people were accustomed to buying them. So we solved that problem with a couple of strategies. One was advertising to talk people into wanting more stuff, and the other was consumer credit to make it easier for people to go into debt to, consume now and pay later. Well, that was a consumer economy. That was the basis of what we call consumerism. That doesn't work in a post-carbon economy because we're going to have, as fossil fuels wane, as we transition to alternative sources of energy, we're not going to have the same kinds of surplus of energy and materials that we had in the 20th century. So rather than a consumerist economy, we're going to need a sufficiency economy where we, instead of measuring economic health with GDP and growth, we begin measuring economic health with satisfaction in people's lives, happiness, what makes life worth living, and it tends to be very different things. It's not just having more stuff. It's being able to spend time with friends and family, living in communities that are safe, where you can walk and bicycle and feel confident and safe. It's not a doom and gloom picture of the future at all, but it is a very different future from what we've been used to over the past few decades.
We're speaking with Richard Heinberg, Senior Fellow of the Post-Carbon Institute, author of many books. His latest is Afterburn, Society Beyond Fossil Fuels. With climate change deniers now in charge of Congress, Richard, how pessimistic are you about public acceptance of global warming?
Well, the public acceptance isn't much different from what it was. In fact, public acceptance of climate change is actually increasing. Of course, you have to acknowledge, even before the Republicans took charge of Congress, basically we weren't doing very much about climate change. So in that sense, maybe there's not going to be that much change politically, but we're running out of time to address this problem before we begin to face economic and ecological disaster. And it's not going to come all at once. It's going to come piecemeal and increasingly year after year. So, hopefully we'll see some more action in Paris later this year with the next big global climate conference. But if we don't have support in Congress for whatever agreements are negotiated there, then the U.S. is just going to be sitting on the sidelines while the rest of the world begins to tackle this crisis of our times.
It seems to me that it would be wise to bring the energy companies into the conversation, make them be a part of it, and let them kind of be the heroes and say, look, why don't you start developing more solar, more hydro, more, that type of thing. Would that be a potential solution to the problem, or is that not enough?
Well, it would be a solution if they were willing to engage in that way. But you look at the world's biggest oil companies, and they are oil companies. And ExxonMobil, for example, has declared that it has no interest in diversifying away from fossil fuels. That is its business model, and it's going to run it into the ground, quite literally. So I think we have to look to new business models and new businesses and other people to guide us into the post-carbon future.
Okay. Now, if it's going to be difficult to wean ourselves from oil and coal, are there other measures that can be taken to forestall inevitable climate change and global warming?
Well, some people are talking about geoengineering, like putting materials up into the atmosphere to block the sunlight so that the planet wouldn't warm as fast. I am not an advocate of that. I think there are other things we could do, like reforestation and something that's called carbon farming. In other words, growing topsoil rather than depleting it, because topsoil is a reservoir of carbon. But, the biggest thing we can do and that we need to do is also the simplest, and that is stop burning fossil fuels. We live in the time of the great burning, I've called it. We annually we burn the fossil fuel equivalent of burning a quarter of the Amazon rainforest. Here in the United States, annually we burn the equivalent in fossil fuels of all the sunlight absorbed by all the green plants in the entire North American continent. We can't keep doing this. One way or another, the hydrocarbon era is coming to an end. So we got to plan for it.
Is it possible to have hydrofracturing or fracking as a means of securing more energy but with stronger environmental controls? I mean, would more regulation drive frackers out of the market?
Well, yeah, more regulation would hamper the industry very significantly. The only reason, actually there were several reasons that fracking took off in the first place, but one of them was exemptions from a whole series of environmental regulations that apply to everybody else, including the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and so on. Famously, this happened back in 2005 with what's called the Cheney Amendment, which exempted the fracking industry from regulation. Another thing that makes this industry work is low interest rates. As long as fracking requires so much debt, which it does, then it also requires very low interest rates in order to remain profitable. So, one way or another, this is a very short-term energy play for the U.S. Both shale gas and tight oil. These are not things that are going to be with us for decades and decades. The production declines very rapidly from each well, requires a lot of drilling. There are only so many places to drill, and those sweet spots in each of the areas where shale gas and tight oil are being produced, those small sweet spots, usually just a county or two, are being drilled out very rapidly. So my organization, Post Carbon Institute, has done a lot of analysis of shale gas and tight oil production. We like to think it's probably the best analysis out there. And it looks to us as though shale gas and tight oil production in the U.S. is going to peak around 2016, 2017, and decline probably quite a bit faster than the U.S. Department of Energy is projecting.
Before we let you go, how do you answer the argument that extraction industries not only provide jobs, but also provide the struggling lower and middle income groups with cheap, convenient fuel?
Yeah, there's some truth there. Sure, oil, coal, and gas industries employ people, but solar and wind actually employ more people per amount of energy produced. And then you got to take the long view of all of this. What do we want? A boom and bust economy? Because that's what fossil fuels are. They always have been. You can drive around in Texas and find old ghost towns that back in the 1910s or 1920s, these were thriving communities where everybody was getting rich and they were trading stocks in new oil wells, and now there's nothing there. We're going to be seeing exactly the same thing in North Dakota and other parts of Texas as the shale boom goes bust. We want jobs, but we want long-term jobs. We want long-term industries. We want an energy infrastructure that has a future to it, and we're not going to get that with fossil fuels. So we're going to have to make some hard choices in this country. It's not just about doing the same thing we've been doing decade after decade. That's going to paint us into a corner. It's going to result in both environmental and economic catastrophe in the end. We have to envision a sustainable, renewable energy future. It's going to be different from what we're used to, but different isn't always bad, especially if we plan for it, and that's what we need to do now.
Okay. Richard Heinberg, Senior Fellow of the Post-Carbon Institute, author of many books, including his latest, Afterburn, Society Beyond Fossil Fuels. Richard, thank you so much for your time with us today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to having you back again soon.
Well, thank you so much, Jim. I appreciate it.
And we appreciate your time with us, of course. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future to keep this show on the air and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, Bill Press and his guest, Peter Kornbluh of The Nation.
Peter Kornbluh from The Nation magazine, author of the great new book, Back Channel to Cuba, The Hidden History of Negotiations Between Washington and Havana, joins us in studio yesterday. He was there at the opening of the embassy yesterday. Hello, Peter.
It's nice to see you, Bill. I haven't seen you since we were sharing mojitos in Havana.
I haven't seen you since you were making mojitos in Havana. We were together on the Nation magazine trip in Havana in May. It was a wonderful trip. You've heard me talk all about it. Peter was our leader and our guide, and yesterday was a huge historic day.
It was a day that
Tell us about being at the embassy. What was it like?
Well, everybody understood that it was a historic day. Everybody was almost giddy about being there, really. And it was an extension of being in Cuba. An embassy is technically the territory of another state, and it was hot, and there was a long line.
Just like being in Cuba?
Just like being in Cuba. But in the end, the wait was worth it. And
raising the flag must have been...
the flag went up. There was an honor guard. They played the Cuban national anthem. A delegation from the U.S. State Department and the White House was there. The foreign minister of Cuba gave a very interesting speech a little bit later after the flag went up. But, the flag went up. It went up slowly. It started blowing in the winds. And you could just feel it was blowing in the winds of change. The winds of change of U.S. policy, of U.S.-Cuban relations. And this is a day, yesterday, July 20th, that I think many people will remember. It's going to go down in history with the opening to Vietnam, the opening to China, a significant change from aggression to cooperation, from estrangement to engagement. I think this is going to be a really important legacy for Barack Obama.
You told us when we were in Cuba, I remember maybe at our first session, that November 17 will be sort of and you were in Cuba that day, will be kind of a national holiday in Cuba.
December 17th.
December, right. I'm sorry,
Right.
December, yeah.
In Cuba, they call that 17D. It sounds like an apartment number, but it's
Really?
17D
Yeah.
is the kind of short acronym for December 17th, 2014, when President Raul Castro and President Barack Obama simultaneously but separately went on their respective national televisions and announced that they were seeking to renew diplomatic relations and bury the hatchet of the hostile past. And sure, that's going to be a day in history as well. But this is what they said would happen: that we would arrive at the reopening of diplomatic
Happened
relations.
sooner than I thought, by the way.
And you know, every day brings some new change to interaction between the United States and Cuba. A few weeks ago, it was the Carnival ship line got permission from the Obama administration to start ferrying passengers like you and me doing kind of people-to-people diplomacy to Cuba. We can't vacation yet until we convince our Congress that we should be allowed to freely travel to Cuba. We can't go on a Carnival cruise line to sit on the beach, but we can go to kind of explore Cuba, learn about Cuba for purposeful educational travel. The ferry services, which were so famous in the 1940s and 1950s before the revolution, from
Starting
Key
up
West,
again. Key
Miami,
West and Miami.
those are
right.
all starting up again.
Peter did a story a little bit earlier about the flights now from BWI starting up.
Kicking up in September, yeah.
In September.
Right.
So we won't have to go like we did to Tampa, right?
That wasn't so bad.
It wasn't so bad, no, but I mean, just up the road.
Yes,
there.
we'll be able to go from Baltimore. There's going to be weekly flights from JFK. JetBlue will, I think, become the first commercial airliner to simply have regular flights to Havana and other parts of Cuba. I mean, it's going to be happening so fast that it's almost mind-boggling. And soon people are going to be saying, particularly younger people, what was the issue with Cuba to begin with? What was the issue with this beautiful Caribbean island?
I think a lot of them are already. We know a lot of them are already saying that.
Yeah.
Generationally, this issue.
It's over and done with.
Yeah.
I mean, for the next generation, it's not even an issue.
Now your book. I mean, the timing on your book was incredible. Your book came out, Back Channel to Cuba. We talked about it. I mean, it was like just about the week, right, or a couple of weeks before the president made his announcement.
Well, it came out October 1st, and the president made his announcement on December 17th, but it was a decent interval, as they say.
Yeah, and you were in Cuba promoting your book when the president made his announcement, right? I mean,
many people thought that somehow I and my co-author, William Leogrand, knew that Barack Obama had been secretly engaging in his own back channel when we were in Cuba, knowing that this guy Alan Gross would be released that day and the 3 Cuban spies would come back that day and all of U.S.-Cuban relations would change forever. And that's not exactly the way it was, but I'm glad that people think that. But what the real issue is that since then we have gone out and reported on what Barack Obama secretly did. And we have a new edition of the book coming out in just a few weeks. It's going to be excerpted in Mother Jones Magazine in the September issue that hits the stands at the end of August, where we have a new epilogue that tells the secret story of how Obama actually secretly negotiated through secret meetings in Canada, at the Vatican with the Pope, using intermediaries going back and forth to Cuba, carrying messages to arrive at July 20th, the normalization of diplomatic relations. It's really a compelling, fantastic story.
It's a phenomenal book. I've read Back Channel to Cuba. I can't wait to read this extra, the paperback edition with this extra chapter.
Absolutely.
So what role, and we'll have a link up on our website too, Peter, for
Absolutely.
Sure, that back Channel to Cuba, and have you back in when the paperback comes out. What role did the Pope play?
You know, everybody wanted the Pope to bless the deal, as it were, and a number of people, including Senator Leahy, Patrick Leahy, who was instrumental in working behind the scenes, even though he didn't know the details of what Obama was secretly doing. He was pushing for a change in policy.
He was there yesterday,
He was there yesterday. I was standing with him and his top aide, Tim Reeser, who is really the unsung hero of a lot of this work. And is going to receive the Washington Office on Latin America Human Rights Award for his work on Cuba in October. Yeah, but Senator Flake was there, Senator Leahy was there, but it was Senator Richard Durbin who actually in September of 2013, I'm giving you a little preview of the Mother Jones article in the new book, kind of said in a meeting at the White House, said, you know, what would happen if the Pope kind of stepped in and said, you should, improve relations with Cuba and swap these prisoners, Alan Gross for the 3 spies, wouldn't you then be able to, he was basically passing a message to the president, wouldn't you then be able to say to Robert Menendez, the now embattled, Democrat who was then chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and completely opposes any deal with the Cubans, wouldn't you be able to say to him that the Pope asked me to do it? That's what Durbin's idea was. And Leahy's office followed up on this, and so, of course, did the White House in the end. They saw the great wisdom of having the Pope involved. So, and the Pope got involved. We tell the story of all the secret back channel messages and letters and how they got here and how complicated it was, and his meeting in Rome with the President of the United States where they discussed the Cuban issue. And he played, I think, a key role and will continue to play a key role. John Kerry is going to go to Cuba on August 14th.
Oh, is that it?
Right.
I was going to ask you if there's a date. There is August 14th.
But then in September, the
24th.
Pope.
Oh, no, 23rd, I guess. Huh?
The Pope is going to Havana and to other parts of Cuba, and then he's come to the United States. And, of course, there'll be worldwide attention to what he says. And he will certainly, at that point, I think, really officially bless the normalization of relations, and I think maybe even call or hint at the need to lift the trade embargo. And this, of course, will have kind of a godlike impact, I think, on the debate.
Right. I just tweeted out a photo to all of our followers of Peter Kornbluh, our guest, making mojitos. We took a little how to make mojito class in Havana at a wonderful little restaurant, rooftop restaurant.
You were the best student, Bill, in that class.
Well, I was a student, but you were the master.
I think you drank the mojito. I think you drank the mojito that I made.
Practice.
No, I remember handing it to you.
But one of the great things about the trip was that every meal we had, there was always a welcome drink. And the welcome drink was usually a mojito, even at noon. Now, yesterday, I want to know.
11 a.m. in the morning, they were serving mojitos at the Hemingway Bar in the Cuban embassy.
That's what I want to hear.
Peter, we've seen him drink martinis at 8:30 in the morning, so this is nothing for him.
I could have handled a mojito at 11 o'clock. Yeah, it was either mojito or Cuba Libre at lunch, and then a dinner, of course. Yeah.
I can tell you, most people were drinking water because it was so hot yesterday. But there were mojitos if you wanted one. If you really had a stellar constitution, you could have a mojito.
Well, Peter makes a mean mojito, I have to tell you. I want to talk more about Pope when we come back, because our first stop in Havana, right from the airport to the Plaza de la Revolucion, right? Isn't that what it's called?
Yes.
Where the Pope will celebrate Mass when he's in.
He will, with more than 1 million people probably.
Wow. All right. Cuba is the topic of the day here, and celebration of the day with the opening of the Cuban embassy here in Washington. Peter Kornbluh was there from The Nation and author of Back Channel to Cuba. Well, we may be celebrating our 10th anniversary here at 12 minutes before the top of the hour, but The Nation magazine is celebrating its 150th anniversary.
We're almost there.
Yeah, that's right. We got
almost
ways
there.
to go. And they've got a big party coming up in Washington. It's on my calendar.
I don't think I've been invited.
What? And Peter Kornbluh was there yesterday, I think, with the publisher, Katrina
Absolutely, yes. Katrina was there. We were there together.
Opening of the Cuban embassy here in Washington, D.C. Peter, who led the trip of The Nation magazine that I went on in May, we had learned a lot and had a lot of fun. Great trip. And the 2 more trips this year by The Nation, end of September and then early November, both of which are already booked.
Apparently, they're full of wonderful people like you.
Charles Bittner told me yesterday. But there will be more in 2016. And I've told
2 more scheduled in 2016 already.
Right? Yeah.
Yes,
I've told everybody
January and April.
There are lots of different people leading groups, but you couldn't do better than go with the Nation magazine. Peter, one of the things that we talked about when we were there, I want to get your take on it again, is I think Americans are worried, right, that you got to get to Cuba like right now, because once Americans get down there, we're going to destroy it. I mean, is Cuba ready to and able to hold its own, if you will? And
that issue came up on the trip that you and I were on again
Many
and again
times.
and again. And you yourself made the astute comment while we were there that people in the group were rushing to Cuba to get there before we ruined it. And there's something a little bit kind of ethnocentric about that observation because the Italians have been going to Cuba.
Yes.
The Canadians who have business interests have been going to Cuba in droves. More than 1.1 million Canadians vacation and travel to Cuba every year and have been traveling to Cuba. It's that we're at the end of the line, us U.S. citizens, of the rest of the world has been going to Cuba, and the rest of the world who are capitalist have been, and spending their money and vacationing and doing all those things, and their companies are there. And Cuba is still Cuba. And Cuba will no more kind of take direction from us on how they should handle the influx of U.S. citizens and U.S. businesses than they would, a year ago when we didn't have normal relations, and the whole issue of lifting the embargo and changing the relation wasn't even on the table. They will make decisions about what's in their best interests, and whether they want to let a McDonald's in or a Walmart in. They understand that they have a very different situation environmentally, having a much more pristine environment with less cars, less chemicals, less fertilizers, and they're going to try and kind of balance the economic needs they have as they work towards developing their economy with hopefully with the cooperation of U.S. companies to the concerns that they themselves have about having an environmentally friendly public health, positive public health situation, and the good things that they feel their people need.
What happens when the Castro brothers die?
Well, Fidel's quite old now. In fact, I think his 88th birthday is coming up in August. And Raul is 84, turning 85, and he has pledged to step aside when his term ends.
What do we know about the new guy? Or do we know who the new guy would be?
Well, yes, he has what's called a first vice president, Miguel Diaz-Canal. And a number of U.S. officials and senators and delegations that have been flowing to Cuba since December 17th have met with Diaz-Canal. They don't meet with Raul Castro, and they understand that he is the designated leader. Now, there's also the Cuban Army, which Raul was defense minister of, led for many years before he officially became president. And, of course, they'll maintain a very high-level role, I believe, in Cuba's future. They're very invested, however, in the tourism industry and the changes that are happening with the United States. I should point out that Raul's son, Alejandro Castro, de Espín, is also a major in the Cuban Interior Ministry. So I would guess he will play a role in the future as well. But the Castros are going to be gone, and U.S.-Cuban relations will have changed. We still have to deal with the history that continues to resonate between our two countries. And even yesterday, the foreign minister, Bruno Rodriguez, here in Washington, repeatedly pointed out that there's still the issue of the Guantanamo naval base.
Yeah.
There's still the issue of the trade embargo, which only Congress can lift.
Reparations.
There's still the issue of reparations. But, well, he didn't point that out. Of course, we are demanding reparations. But now these talks about these issues are going to take place under a different framework, and that's what's so important about what happened yesterday.
Now, the best recommendation you gave us in Cuba was the restaurant where we had the lobster. What's the name of it? Do you remember?
It was
I forget.
It was one of the seaside restaurant, wasn't it?
Yeah, in the Miramar.
Vista del Mar, was it?
I think it's Vista del Mar. You're right. Yeah, Peter said it was the best lobster he had ever had, and I must tell you, it's the best lobster I ever had too. It was
it was sautéed in butter and garlic and butterflied and almost like
I know.
It was
oh man.
And,
with a little onion
and match that with a mojito and. You're in heaven.
And you listen to the pounding of the sea up against the restaurant's literally on the water, and there's this seawall right there.
Yeah.
And the waves come smashing against the wall, and they pour over the wall into the swimming pool that's between you and the and the water. And so it's a wonderful place to eat. I'm glad you ate there.
While you're eating your lobster.
How
amazing. So the book, again, Peter's a co-author with William Leogrand, right?
Yes.
It's Back Channel to Cuba. A paperback comes out early October. It'll be, you can read it, though, in excerpt from it, in Mother Jones in September. The additional backstory, back channel.
That's right.
To Cuba. Peter, thanks so much for coming. Congratulations.
Thank you, Bill.
All right.
We'll see you in Cuba.
Soon again. We'll be right back.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Fred Rotondaro, Richard Heinberg, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us, support the show, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate.